Welcome back as I continue my multi-post conversation about misleading data. No discussion would be complete without mentioning how to interpret data and graphs, especially if they can be misleading. Today's topic is improper or no scaling for charts and graphs. Do you believe that people are inherently good and want to tell the truth? I'd like to think so, but sometimes I wonder when I see some data visualizations. Did the creator just not know data visualization best practices? Did they not have the proper tools or training? Or were they actually trying to mislead? In my experience, playing with a graph scale is one of the most common ways to mislead. Sometimes there are good reasons behind doing this. Maybe the author doesn't think the scale matters, or maybe they think it is more important to focus on the detail, like using a microscope on the data. But then I would suggest being more purposeful with the type of graph selected, because most times you really need to be careful how you scale your graphs or they can be misleading, either intentionally or not. The most common problem mentioned when talking about improper scaling of a graph is not starting the y-axis at 0. It should be noted this is a general rule for bar graphs in particular, but bar graphs tend to be very commonly used because they are about comparisons. When you change the context for that comparison by changing the starting point to a number other than 0, the interpretation can get skewed. Line graphs can bend this rule just a little bit because they are about seeing changes, usually over time. So if your purpose is to focus on the changes, not the comparison, and you really want to start higher than 0, you should probably switch from a bar to a line graph rather than change the scale on your bar graph. Let's look at an example. The graph on the left shows about a 10% increase in units over a 12-month period when starting the graph at 0, with each month going up slightly compared to the prior month. The graph on the right shows what looks like almost a 200% increase over the same 12-month period because the graph started at 9,400 instead of 0. Ironically, when I highlighted the data to graph, Microsoft Excel actually gave me the misleading graph first. See how easy it is to mislead without even thinking about it? But what if you wanted to narrow in on the detail of a graph? In general, you should always show the original context or the graph on the left. Then if you want to narrow in on the detail or show the month-over-month changes, you can switch to a line graph to highlight this information. While the bar graph on the left shows small increases each month, the line graph on the right shows how consistent and equal those changes were. So if you wanted the monthly comparison, as well as the consistency of growth month over month, you may want to include the additional detail and show both graphs. Unfortunately, changing the scale is one of the most common methods used in advertising, politics, and media. I did a previous video on how dangerous cherry-picking data can be, but when data can't be cherry-picked, changing the scale on a graph can also be used to strengthen an idea as a way to make it seem more credible. I always get a little upset when I see misleading graphs in fields that are meant to inform or educate. I know that companies want to sell their products, but when they resort to misleading people using data and graphs, I find it very disappointing. I often use this Chevy ad from 1992 to emphasize how not starting a graph at 0 can be misleading when it comes to affecting consumer decision-making. The ad says that more than 98% of Chevy trucks that were sold in the last 10 years are still on the road, but the graph makes it look like a considerably higher percentage of Chevy trucks are on the road compared to other makes. Although the ad is factually accurate, about 98.3% of all Chevy trucks sold in the last 10 years are still on the road, the graph scale starts at 95%. This means that more than 95% of all the makes of trucks they graphed were still on the road. Well, as of 1992 anyway. If I'm being generous, maybe they were not aware of the impact of their improper scaling. Maybe they were just wanted to focus on how Chevy is the leader. But then again, maybe not. Which is the reason I'm making these videos, to inform both creators and their audiences about misleading data. As a final example on improper scaling, I wanted to show graphs with no scaling at all. Here's an example of a graph that is trying to show the expected growth of the laundry pods market share by region from 2022 to 2032. Although they put a reference point of $4.9 billion as the market size on the first bar, there is no real way for the reader to make comparisons with the information provided. Did the y-axis start at $0 or $2 billion? Is Europe half of North America for 2022 if the graph started at 0? Will North America grow by 20%? 25%? Maybe it will only grow by 10% by 2032 if the graph doesn't start at zero. All you can do is estimate based on your own ideas or beliefs, which makes the graph very confusing at best or misleading at worst. So, next time you see a chart or graph, especially a bar graph, and one that's in a context that is meant to inform or educate, pause for a minute and look at the scaling. Does the y-axis start at zero? If not, why not? What information or message do you think the author is trying to convey by not starting the y-axis at zero or not including scaling at all?